It started a trend where people started using different words, such as Dalit Patriarchy, and there on Sunaina Arya also published her work where she also said that, other type of terms are not used, like, Baniya Patriarchy, Rajput Patriarchy. So why only Dalit Patriarchy? And on that note, what would you like to say on that note?
I really like to say that. I used it, I think, somewhat less consciously than I should have. Ambedkar also said that essentially this is an attempt to preserve the community, the caste group as it stands. And one of his, in fact, Ambedkar gives us the first tools, because in his Columbia Caste and Genesis, he's already talking about all that. Feminists have only picked it up from him. They've picked it up from him, but he speaks as an insider. Some of us have written from the position that we came to understand as we looked at the institutions around us, and we started to ask questions of these institutions. That is how actually we wrote, those of us who did write on caste and patriarchy, we really got it from over a period of time, because you cannot be a feminist if you stand for inequality anywhere. So as far as I'm concerned, if you claim to be a feminist, then you can't be supporting caste, you can't be supporting class, or even fundamentalist ideas around nationalism and so on. If you have so many intercaste marriages, you will actually be unable to preserve the boundaries of the caste. And over a period of time, caste itself will become much looser. And let's not forget that what Phule has said about knowledge. Knowledge is power is something that he said long before Foucault said. Okay. So what is Foucault and all these other characters, Orientalists, Said and all of these fellows, I'm in that book. And most importantly, as far as I was concerned, I was writing for an audience which it had to be accessible. So I had to write in a style in which everyone could read it and everyone could enjoy it. Now that's a challenge for an academic, because academics tend to, sort of obfuscate and stuff like that. So I wrote it in a different kind of. One reason why it has survived in the public sphere is because of all of those things. It's more difficult to be a feminist than it is to be a Dalit activist or a Marxist activist or anyone. Actually, the most extraordinary story I ever came across was that Anarkali was a boy. So it was a homosexual relationship that was problematic.
Jai Bhim everyone, I'm Shainal Verma. I'm a PhD scholar at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Delhi. Today I'm here with Uma Chakravarti, a known feminist historian. The conversation today is going to be very important because it is about the feminist discourse in India. Uma Chakravarti herself has extensively written about gender and caste and the intersections of women's lives that we must focus on. Her work not just tells us that there is one positionality in a woman's life that is important, but there are multiple spheres and avenues that shape our experiences. Her work is also on early Buddhism and the contemporary historian, subjects. Hello, ma'am. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
And with that, we shall. Today, as I'm talking to you, I'm also reminded of the kind of violence that surrounds us. Violence specifically towards, what is seen as the feminist discourse. And the conversation often becomes that feminists are anti-men. And they are women who, are just dangerous for the society. On that, as we all know. And so on that front, what are your views about this growing discourse that feminism is an anti-men discourse? What do you have to say about that?
The simplest description of feminism is those who believe that there should be equality between men and women and who want that equality established are feminist. Okay, a feminist is someone who actually seeks equality in all spheres. And I also do believe that you cannot be a feminist if you stand for inequality anywhere. So as far as I'm concerned, if you claim to be a feminist, then you can't be supporting caste, you can't be supporting class, or even fundamentalist ideas around nationalism and so on. Feminism is a position about treating all sections of society as equal and having equal rights and having equal right to be who they want to be, okay? And wherever there are structures that obstruct that, they will naturally stand against it. So unless men are going to position themselves as asserting their rights over women, there is no reason why feminists would be having to take on. They are anti-patriarchy. They're not anti-men. So if men are not patriarchal,
Absolutely.
there's no question of women being against, a feminist being against them.
I wish everyone understood that feminism is not about a gender, rather it's a movement, rather it's a cause that so many of us strive for. And on that note, how do we also understand patriarchy in the Indian context?
See, patriarchy everywhere. Patriarchy is problematic everywhere, wherever it asserts itself, which is the superiority of men over women and their entitlement to all the power in that society is what can be boiled down to the essence of patriarchy. Now, there are many societies which are where men might be have a superior position, but they may not be as violent and as complex and as repressive as other places are. So if you look at, for instance, you might find egalitarian tribal societies. As a sociologist, you might know all of that. The reason for, but as societies became more and more unequal, and the men asserted more and more power, arrogated more and more power to themselves over women, and we must remember that they assert rights also over children. So women and children are under the custody, regarded as under the custody of men, and also as being subordinate to them. The problem lies with this, not with the whatever. Now, across the world, patriarchy is problematic, okay? And whatever you may say, and there is patriarchy across the world. Let's not think that it's unique to India or South Asia or whatever. But in South Asia, it assumes a much more virulent form because patriarchy, South Asian patriarchy, is closely linked to the reproduction of caste. And so all patriarchy controls the sexuality of women and asserts the rights to the children because, as societies became more complex and property came into existence, the passing on of property from one generation to another became contingent on the assertion that these are your children. The man had to feel safe that this is his, that the children were his. So controls over women are worldwide and they take place in various forms. Historically also they have been evolved in very complex ways. But in South Asia, because patriarchy is linked to the reproduction of caste also. So it's not only the fact that the father passes his property on to his son, but the father has to, father and the father's kin group has to reassert the purity of the blood. So then the concern about controlling women's sexuality is much greater. And so when caste is linked to the reproduction of, to the lineage, to the passing on of property, and you get the question of pure caste blood, then the control over women's sexuality becomes that much more complicated. Now, much of the problem in and I say South Asian society because we share it in some form or the other. It doesn't matter whether you are in Nepal or in Pakistan or whatever. Marriages are arranged. And marriages are arranged by the men. Women consent to it, but marriages are really arranged with. So you are controlling the structure of property and uh, reproducing caste blood, and you are violently preventing any leakage of that system, any way in which that system can be dented. This means that you, for instance, even, we are living in North India, even in South India. We know that if you marry outside of the caste and you make a marriage which you have chosen to do, then, and it is outside your endogamous group, then there can be violence, and there's a lot of violence that you can see. So the idea that izzat and honor, which is, I write quote unquote, that is something that is in the hands of men to preserve, is, and let's also be clear that women consent to it. So the mothers will also uphold that same principle. It's an attempt to ensure that the structure remains intact. And there's a lot of violence as a consequence of that. So in one sense, why do we have so much violence? It is because the undercurrent of it, and then we don't understand that. We just see this as, it's a defiance of the family or whatever. But it is over a period of time, if you have so many intercaste marriages, you will actually be unable to preserve the boundaries of the caste. And over a period of time, caste itself will become much looser and much more, there'll be a lot of leakages around it. And which is why, Ambedkar also said that essentially this is an attempt to preserve the community, the caste group as it stands. And one of his, in fact, Ambedkar gives us the first tools, because in his Columbia Caste and Genesis, he's already talking about all that. Feminists have only picked it up from him. They've picked it up from him, but he speaks as an insider. Some of us have written from the position that we came to understand as we looked at the institutions around us, and we started to ask questions of these institutions. That is how actually we wrote, those of us who did write on caste and patriarchy, we really got it from over a period of time, because we were also, and in my case, I would like to say it is the Mandal movement that made it absolutely imperative for me to look at the question of caste.
Now that we see, there is Radha Kumar who wrote The History of Doing and how the women's movements came up, and with so much of like fighting and resisting for your own human natural rights that were there. And then there was, as you mentioned, the Mandal movement, which centered conversation on caste. And then we also see how knowledge production around it kind of, shaped itself with that entire transformation. Yeah. So with that, how do you see this entire, last decade, the change that has come into academia, where questions of gender and caste, they're also taking center stage, like in university spaces. There are also students who might not be from these disciplines. Now they are suddenly interested to write about these issues.
Yeah.
So what do you have to say about this? Where caste suddenly is so central, specifically in the feminist movement, and how do you think that this kind of centering of caste, what kind of implications it might have for us to understand? Like you've already told us, but then there is, I feel that the centering of caste in the women's movement and the kind of intersectionality that it gives us. It might, the lens is very different, I feel, in both the ways.
Yeah.
Because I also remember that when my entry into, the entire feminist discourse happened, I was not reading so much on caste that moment, and I was in JNU that time. So the reading list itself was shaped in a manner, and then there were very few works, starting from Sharmila Rege and, few of them, and then your work, of course, Ambedkar has been a huge influence on all of our works. But then even today, I feel that what are your views about the entire caste question in the women's movement?
See, I think that again we need to, for North India, Caste has been much more understood as a reality in peninsular India. Okay, south of the Vindhyas, I think people have been shaped by, or they understood the caste question much sharper. In Maharashtra, of course, there's a strong movement which tried to theorize caste. Similarly, in Tamil Nadu, there's a large number of people, right, starting off from Ayodhya Das and so on, who have been writing on caste. So, in a sense, the South was more familiar with the caste question, and in fact, because you don't have, like in Karnataka, you don't have a very large number of Brahmins. Dominant castes become that much more important from the point of view of holding caste power. And so, interestingly, in those southern states, caste-based reservations were quite, had been pushed for, lobbied for, and they had been achieved. Okay, but North India, by and large, got left out over there. Mandal actually broke, and Mandal is important because it's the reservations were given, and we must see the logic of VP Singh. He is going for what? He is actually announcing it for the civil services. Everyone knows that civil services is a way gain entry into state power.
Absolutely.
So you may have other kinds of power. You may have dominant caste status, you may have land, you may have whatever. But unless you can capture the state and hold it, you can't. You are still subjected to certain kinds of pressure. Now they understood very well, and I do remember that when Mandal was announced, and we went from college to college talking, because there was this. I was living on the campus at that stage, and you could see people come out in a very focused, calculated way with dandas and whatever it is, and then beat up, break the public transport, and so it was very calculated in the way. And we were going around there and saying, "Why are you doing this?" Because some of us were somewhat, we were trying to stop this violence, and we had a small group in the university which was quite active on this question. So I remember saying, somebody said, why are you bothered about this thing? You people, neoliberalism was also starting off at roughly the same time, that you will get all these private places, private jobs. You will have a control over all the private jobs. Why are you so interested in this? They said, no. And the boys, there are a lot of these boys from Eastern UP, Bihar and whatever it is, they were very clear. They said, एक भाई civil service में जाएगा, एक भाई पुलिस में जाएगा, और एक भाई जमीन पर रहेगा. So that is how you'll control. That reproducing the dominance is very critical. So you need to have your access to state power is one way in which you will maintain that. So they knew exactly what they were defending. It was very clear. So in one sense, the shock was to understand how complex and how casteist Indian society was. Now, on the whole, the feminists came from sections of the middle classes and maybe urban educated and stuff like that, the first generation of them. And there was always this pretense that they don't have caste. Okay, they are urban, they're metropolitan, they don't have caste. So it came as a huge shock to them that there was this very violent movement. You must also remember it was a very, very intense moment from the point of view of emotions, because these young men were burning themselves up. Right. They were setting themselves on fire. You can imagine what it does to the psyche of people. Absolutely. There's all this concern. And I remember at that time saying it's very strange that they should respond to the young man who's burning. And nobody should burn, okay? But when women's bodies were being burnt by their in-laws, it had less horror. But these young men burning themselves was like, it captured the public imagination in a certain kind of way. So there was the media itself was, playing its own role and so on. And feminists in urban centers were to some extent dislocated and disoriented. They didn't quite understand what was going on. And we had to actually pick it up at that stage, some of us. And I don't know what it was. Maybe it is because I had studied, perhaps I was poised in a certain kind of way to be able to look at this question from an academic and a feminist lens. See, I'm a trained historian of early Indian history. Okay, so I read the texts. I've read the texts. My work was on Buddhism. My work was, my PhD work is called The Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism. I had a whole chapter on the people who join the Sangha and from what social origins they came. So I was already quite tuned in to the idea of looking at the complexity of a time and who responds to social movements which are progressive. Okay, so in one sense, the tools were all there, and because of that, I think that I was perhaps better equipped to start exploring this question. So the caste question, and I was already a feminist, so caste and patriarchy became for me axes that I was drawn to, and I could see the linkages between the two, and so in some ways it was a natural kind of move in that direction, and that is why my gendering caste. If you look at the book, see, I had earlier written a paper which was called Conceptualizing Brahmanical Patriarchy. It's completely based on ancient Indian texts. Okay, people may not like it. The current dispensation will be out, but I'm citing from Manu. I'm citing from the older texts. Yeah, I'm citing from all the old texts. Okay, and you're getting the picture. That is this obsession with purity of blood and controlling the wife's sexuality. So I had already written that paper, but I hadn't done the larger, I didn't have the larger understanding or the larger study that I needed to make, which is what went into gendering caste as a manuscript, finally, when I wrote that. And I was able to bring everything that I had learnt over the years, including the popular mythology and so on. So you'll find in that book, there's reference to Eklavya, and it's there as a story. It's like simply as an interesting story. And you can see why is it that Eklavya has to lose his thumb, because the Kshatriyas have to be the only people who can use so even the Nishadas and the tribal people from their own regions cannot have the same skill. The Kshatriya must have the biggest skill, and weaponry is in his control. What is weaponry? Weaponry is military power. Okay, so you can suppress everybody with that. Then there's the Shambhuka story, and the Shambhuka story takes you in another direction, which is how is it that a simple act of a man sitting and meditating and trying to gain access to knowledge, and let's not forget that what Phule has said about knowledge, I mean, knowledge is power is something that he said long before Foucault said. Okay. So what is this Foucault and all these other characters, Orientalists, Said and all of these fellows? I mean, Jyotiba Phule has already said it, because he's talking about unless you understand, you can't challenge. And what is it that Shambhuka was doing? He was gaining knowledge. And he gets his head cut off for that, at the end of the day. And today you might turn around and say, Nani, Uttarakhand is later, sorry, not Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand is later, and so it's an interpolation. But the fact of the matter is that it's part of the Ramayana story, and his head is cut off because he's practicing tapasya to gain knowledge. So, these things also go to try and understand the complexity of what the caste and gender questions are in the Indian context. So that line that I was able to develop for in that book, and most importantly, as far as I was concerned, I was writing for an audience which it had to be accessible. So I had to write in a style in which everyone could read it and everyone could enjoy it. Now that's a challenge for an academic, because academics tend to, sort of obfuscate and stuff like that. So I wrote it in a different kind of. One reason why it has survived in the public sphere is because of all of those things.
No, I remember reading a paper on Brahmanical patriarchy, and there on the conceptualization of, I also feel it started a trend where people started using different words, such as Dalit Patriarchy, and there on Sunaina Arya also published her work where she also said that, other type of terms are not used, like Baniya patriarchy, Rajput patriarchy. So why only Dalit patriarchy?
Yeah.
And on that note, what would you like to say on that note?
I'd really like to say that. I used it, I think, somewhat less consciously than I should have. And this was pointed out to me actually by Rajni Tilak, who's a Dalit feminist activist, Jyotsna's mother. But she was my friend. I knew her. And she said, why use the term Dalit patriarchy? And I completely agree. If I have to, in fact, I will put in a gloss. What we should say is caste-based patriarchy, which is in a hierarchy. So the patriarchy that obtains amongst, say, the OBCs is different from the patriarchy that obtains amongst the Brahmins.
Absolutely.
Now, what is the logic of the Brahmins have to reproduce only one child in order to, we have a son to burn his rights. But actually, middle castes need to use the sexuality of women to be able to reproduce as laboring hands, because they own small bits of land, but they also work on the lands. And both men and women work on the land. So I learnt this from my friend Prem Chaudhary's work, who's worked on Haryana. So over a period of time, you see that actually it's a very complex system. And as Ambedkar pointed out very succinctly, he said, one of the dramatic things he does is that he does not, he's at the other end, I mean, he's long before Dumont anyway, but, he's actually writing as a person who's experienced the inequality of caste. So he writes, he doesn't use the terms purity and pollution. That's very important for us, because whose terms are these? Those are Brahmanical terms. Instead, he uses, as you go up the caste hierarchy, you find the reverence increases. As you go down the caste hierarchy, you see the contempt increases.
Absolutely.
So using those terms are extremely powerfully conceptualized, and it allows us to see that we don't want these categories. What we should be devising our own means of understanding what is being said. So in that sense, I actually began to feel that there is such a thing as caste-based, therefore, complex patriarchal customs, which are distinct according to the place where you are located. And again, anthropologists helped me to do that. I didn't do that work because, and Pauline Kolenda, for instance, her work is very powerful because she's talking about the fact that at the bottom of the scale, where you have the greatest inequality, those women's sexuality you continue to use. And where you have wife sales, you might actually then, if the husband dies, you might actually pass her on to some other kin member of your family, okay? And if not your kin, then you might even pass her on to someone, and you may recover your bride price from that. So it's a very complex structure. And the complexity is part of the evil genius, and let's consider that everyone is invested in it. So all patriarchy is offensive and not to be accepted. And equally, caste-based patriarchy is something that we should understand and be able to challenge. So I would now reformulate and not call it Dalit patriarchy, because what's the point? Then I have to say OBC patriarchy. Yeah. So if I say caste-based patriarchy, then you get the gradations. And the rationale is always more complex than simply caste. It's economic, it's multiple things that fit into that. So I would not hang on to it. And I owe this point to Rajni, because she's the one who pointed it out to me.
That's a lot. I mean, for people who are trying to grapple the entire feminist politics and the role of caste in it, for them to understand and to engage with. But I would say that for me personally, the making of me as someone who calls herself as a feminist has only been possible because of the kind of readings that I've engaged with and the access to it also, which I was unable through the pedagogy and my professors. So I would also like to ask you that, so much of us also, some of us call or label ourselves as feminists, while some refrain from doing so. And like we started on that note that anti-men narrative is there कि मैं अपने आप को feminist क्यों बोलूं कि मैं तो equality में मानती हूँ but I don't have to call myself a feminist. So do you think it really makes a difference if you call yourself a feminist or you don't? Because as women, I think in our own capacities, we're all trying to resist.
See, to the extent that the feminist is poised against patriarchy as a system, okay, you can still use the term a feminist, but I think everybody can fall within that category. Men can be feminist also, because if you stand against patriarchy, look at the harm that patriarchy does to men. You know, be forced to live in a certain kind of way, and
You
so
can't
on.
cry.
You can't cry. You can't feel. You can't. You can't touch your own inner selves and so on. So at the end of the day, you can use any form. But the feminist is one who actually stands against. I would simply define it as stands against the power of men over women. If you knock that out, then, and if we actually had an equalitarian society, we would not need terms like that, you know. So it seems to me that that's the critical issue that we should focus on. And we can all be, we have to all be anti-casteist and all be anti-patriarchy. Equalitarian in our spirit and in our thinking, that everyone is entitled to rights and the same rights as anyone else. So you can't hierarchize rights and say you have more and you have less. That's one of the wrongs that's, I mean, human beings have not proved themselves to be very, let's say, humane and democratic in their instinct. Why do they create systems in which you have slavery, which you have, caste, which you have, where you have such doses of power over somebody else that it's so I often say this, and I really think that I would like this statement to be taken. I think that we are on the wrong track. We are doing separate movements. We're doing anti-class movement, we're doing anti-caste movement, we're doing feminist movement. We actually have to battle at the same time and everyone should battle for that society where everyone is equal. There is no patriarchy, there is no hierarchy, caste-based hierarchy, and there is no inequality of resources. I mean, everyone has a right to live, everyone has a right to be fed and reproduce themselves. It seems to me that that's the movement we should be, fighting for. Not saying, did we have glory in the past, what a wonderful society we were. Sorry, you'll never find a wonderful society. In history, you'll never find a wonderful society. And when you come to South Asia, it will get much worse, because here we have hierarchy in so many different forms, which is like really quite offensive. So I think we shouldn't be doing separate movements. So we should actually be all moving for change in the same way and hitting at the unequal system simultaneously so that system can be shaken. And I think to that extent, we are natural collaborators.
Absolutely.
We're all in that same alliance.
We're all striving to make the Begumpura.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. A Begumpura. I mean, look at the way in which people conceptualized it in our past. I mean, why would they need to create a Begumpura if Begumpura existed? So we have to, the vision has to be of a society which is humane and equal. That's it. Humane and equal.
I wish that things were, as our ideas of and our utopia of love and social justice is. I wish the society was like that. But in the contemporary educational, let's say, for instance, the educational setup, there is a Dalit woman, Dr. Ritu, who's been staging a protest since 160 days. And what kind of, the responsibility of the state or the system is in actually responding to her, where we see very, I would say, very little participation from all spheres of life. Then there is also the growing, nationalist or religious nationalism that is growing every day, where we see on social media, women are actually putting up videos where they're drinking water from their husbands' feet. They're washing the feet and they're drinking that water. So this kind of incidents where we see on the social media, women are doing this, and on field sites where we see women are protesting, there are Dalit women, there are somewhere in India there is a Muslim woman who's protesting against her right to wear a hijab, and there is this so much to the women's movement today. But what would your take be, that what can we really think about a future for women in India today?
Well, see, one of the things that we need to figure, it's more difficult to be a feminist than it is to be a Dalit activist or a Marxist activist or anyone. I'll tell you why. Because in the case, and I often used to teach this to my students also, just to see, it's very easy. It's easier for you to go home and say, ये मालिक जो है वो मुझे सताता है, and you can actually even curse him. You can do this to the upper caste man who's dominating you. It's very difficult for a woman to turn around and say, ये मुझे सताता है, and it is, who are they? भाई, बाप, husband. How do you actually stand there and say, because you're tied to them, and the ideology and socialization is so huge that you actually believe that it's wrong for you to think like that. So it's very difficult. Now, some people gain from this. It's very easy for them to say, कि हम करना चाहते हैं, हाँ? ये मेरा, he's like a god, and I must, worship him. This is my right. My own college mates, I met her after many, many years, and she said, but, isn't it that a cart can move only when there are both wheels go along with it? What is this? What kind of metaphor is that, Why are you creating a different size for the wheel, on either side? And you're then trying to tell me that is natural. So we are actually, what are we? We are, I think we're the most idealistic and most humane of people, because we are seeking humanity, a humane society, and an equal society. So what is the problem with that, and why should anyone have any objection to that? You humanize society, I'll be perfectly fine with you. Absolutely. And if your religion is telling me that you can humanize it, and there'll be no caste discrimination, and there'll be no gender discrimination, I'll be perfectly, that's fine. I have my own I may not call it Ram Rajya, but the fact is, I have an understanding of what is a society that I would like to live in. Absolutely. And that is something for us to achieve. You give it to us, why are you fighting with us?
So Professor Uma, as we have already talked about at great lengths, the way gender and caste impact women around us, and also men and different people. And that takes me back to the idea of intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw coined, and there has been so much of uproar about this entire term that many even call it a buzzword now, कि हर चीज intersectional हो गई है. But on that note, what would you like to say, that how does feminism benefits from this intersectional framework? And looking at the kind of social exclusions that some marginalized groups may have faced in the women's movement, and there's also the naming of women as TERF, which I didn't personally know until I had a word with few of my queer friends who told me what TERF actually means, and I was like, okay.
You need to tell me what TERF means, because I don't know.
TERF means a trans exclusionary feminist. TERF.
Yeah, okay. Let's get to the bottom of the issue.
Right.
The bottom of the issue is that there are inequalities that exist even in. So when we position ourselves and say we stand for feminism or feminist change, we are attacking patriarchy. What is it about patriarchy that's problematic? Okay, it's not only the fact that men have power over women. It's also to do with the fact that the control over women's sexuality is something that's essential to creating subordination of women, but it is also privileges heterosexuality automatically, because if you're obsessed with biological reproduction, then biological reproduction requires you to have control over whatever. And I would suggest now, for instance, the famous essay that Gail Rubin wrote, which is called Trafficking in Women. She has a very interesting line over there. She says, men and women are, the young couple, are the objects of the relationship. They are not the sub. They don't choose their partners. That is decided by the clans or by the communities around them. Now, heterosexuality has been imposed as a norm because it's the emphasis is on reproduction. And as reproduction becomes more and more complex in terms of reproducing class and caste orders, the concern for controlling reproduction will get that much more intense, right? So she says, for instance, that suppose, the young couple cannot decide. Now imagine a situation where she says, I don't want this man. You don't even get this kind of thing. I don't want this man, I want that man. But suppose you were to turn around and say, I don't want this man, I want this woman. What does that mean? It upsets the entire structure of reproduction and of the systems that you've put into place. Now, you'll find that a number of societies ignore questions of sexuality and choice within that, as long as women's sexuality is kept under control and they indulge in, they are married at the appropriate age, which is why, the history around a woman being young and being married when she's young and so on is so strong, because it's like, now that kind of thing, we should also remember that heterosexuality, so desire doesn't count. In South Asia, in South Asia, it doesn't count at all. And desire leads to death. You can see from the thing that is happening. I often say, why is it that all our stories are Laila Majnu or Heer Ranjha or Soni Mahal? Why do the couples always die? Because you can't consider that you can allow people to fall in love and actually create a sustaining relationship out of it. Now, one of the most interesting stories I ever came across was I was reading a book on anarchy. And what was really interesting over there was that what was really tricky in that anarchy story is not that anarchy is not a woman. वो slave थी, whatever it is. And that's why it was, she was the bandi of Akbar and he didn't like it and stuff like that. Actually, the most extraordinary story I ever came across was that Anarkali was a boy. So it was a homosexual relationship that was problematic. So in a sense, control over sexuality of men and women is part of the structure of reproduction. Now, there's a little bit more latitude that's given to men. Now, so if you look at it from the point of view of how desire had to be channelized. Now, many societies allowed homosexuality to a certain extent. That doesn't mean that they consider that that was the only choice. You may reproduce, but then your partner, your real romance might be with a man, So I think the older systems were able to accommodate to some extent this kind of thing. But, now the choice question is very scary. And I remember a friend of mine writing, she was writing, she said, we give choice to women in everything. You can vote, you can buy in the market, and market is pro-choice. All the time they're telling you, buy this, buy that, and you have choice in the matter. But choice in the context of a partner and a sexual partner is not to be allowed. So in a sense, this hysteria around, so intersectionality, I never thought of intersectionality as a term, and I never considered. I became an intuitive practitioner of quote-unquote intersectionality, because I was bringing in caste into the understanding, where the only framework was class. Okay, to that extent, I was in a way I was pushing the lines a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that since inequality is multiple and in so many different spheres, automatically feminists and equalitarian people and humane people and people who believe in the right to be who you are must fight against all of these axes. So you have to, in practice, you have to be intersectional. And so at the end of the day, whether it is trans or whatever, I mean, you have a right to be who you are.
Absolutely.
That's it at the end of the day, because we are against repression of any form, in any form. So we are intuitive practitioners of intersectionality rather than conscious. At least I would put myself in that category.
No. With that, we end today's very enriching discussion on gendering caste with Professor Uma, and Jai Bhim to everyone, Jai Savitri. अब हम आगे बढ़ते रहेंगे और हम लड़ते रहेंगे
और समझने की कोशिश करेंगे और लिखते रहेंगे.
लिखते तो रहेंगे.
सही है. Thank you.